Today, we're diving into one of the most heated debates in the world of work. Where should work happen? You know, some leaders are demanding a full return to the office. Others are embracing remote first policies, and most have ended somewhere in between. But is this so-called hybrid compromise actually working? Research can suggest it often delivers the worst of both worlds. So to help us make sense of this, I'm joined by Ranya Nehmeh, a senior HR strategist, lecturer, and co-author of the forthcoming book, In Praise of the Office, The Limits to Hybrid and Remote Work. And Ranya has held senior HR roles at organizations like the OPEC Fund and the European Central Bank. And her recent work in the Harvard Business Review has challenged leaders to rethink how we build culture, manage talent, and sustain performance in a post-pandemic world. So together, we're going to explore why hybrid models are still stumbling, what leaders can do differently, and why the physical office may still hold unique and irreplaceable value. Welcome, Ranya.
Hi, Lucy. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Oh, I've been so looking forward to this. And the book's coming out soon, isn't it?
Absolutely. September 30th. So
September
a few more
30th.
weeks.
So by the time this podcast goes out, it should be already out there.
Exactly.
But before we get into the issues raised in your book, which, as we know, has a very controversial title these days, let's hear a bit more about you. So can you just give me a brief history of your journey to date and how you came to write a book on this topic?
Totally. Thanks so much again. So yes, I have, as you mentioned, over 20 years of work experience, mainly in HR. I actually started my career in London in a telecoms company, and then moved around a little bit, worked in different places before landing back in Vienna, where I was actually born, and working at the OPEC Fund, where I spent a lot of my adult actually career. I've held different HR roles, from technical, operational, strategic, leadership, throughout the whole employee experience cycle. And in the last 2 years, I was in Frankfurt at the European Central Bank, also in the realm of HR, but specifically talent management and leadership. Currently, I am also an adjunct professor at a university in Vienna, where I teach a course on leadership in the new world of work. I had written one book previously called The Chameleon Leader, which is about leadership, specifically focused on millennials. But that was already 5 years ago, because now we're only talking about Gen Zs.
Yeah.
And yes, and as you mentioned, in 2 weeks, the book In Praise of the Office will be released. And
so what made you want to write a book on praising the office?
And it's very ironic, because if somebody would have told me that 5 years ago, I would have said, no way. So I cannot speak about Peter. I cannot speak, on behalf of Peter, my co-author, about why he wrote the book. But I can say from my side, it's really based on my experience. Specifically, when we first went hybrid or fully remote in 2020, it was the first time ever that I had actually worked remote. And I was so wowed that it worked at the time. And I really felt like everything is getting done. I have flexibility, I have autonomy. It doesn't get better than this, right? That was when we were all remote. Everyone was working from home. Then slowly we started into the hybrid setups. And now it's been obviously like 4 years, 5 years. And I can really see the challenges that we've had over the years in various different companies. And when I spoke to Peter about it, we both said that this conversation has become so one-sided now. And very few people were really looking into what are the challenges, because even the biggest proponents of hybrid work or remote work, they must see that there are some challenges. So we decided it's time to tackle that narrative and to really examine, that question, like what are the challenges and is there a way to fix it? Can we fix them?
Well, I'm so looking forward to this conversation. We're going to kick it off with looking at what we're talking about, which of course hybrid work, the so-called middle ground. where people are permitted to work at home for some of the time, and then they have to be in the office for some of the time. And as you pointed out, this is the model that most organizations have gone with. And I have my own views on the kind of limitations of this, but I really want to hear from you about, because you argue that this compromise often creates the worst of both worlds. So can you just elaborate on why you make that argument?
Sure. So hybrid, from what we've seen now, it was really the preferred option for both employers and employees. And that's why it's considered the best of both worlds. But we really found that often it is also considered the messy middle, simply because it is very difficult to manage. And you need different skills to manage that kind of setup. So what we see is you're asking people to come into the office, but not giving them perhaps a compelling reason as to why. You're paying for very expensive office space, but it's often half empty and devoid of all of the things that actually make the office, the collaboration, the get-togethers, the energy, the culture. And meanwhile, employees are also sometimes confused. Should I be in? Should I not be in? There's also scheduling headaches because, there's a lot of coordination involved. If certain times you need to be in the office, but are these being communicated? Many times it's not. Meetings become also harder to schedule because everybody is all over. And also we see that it has encouraged practices like coffee badging, where you go into the office, you swipe your card, you go in, you have a coffee, maybe you chit chat to somebody, and then you leave. So it's counted as a day in the office. But in fact, you're not there. You're not meaningfully doing anything that you should do in the office, right? So these are, I would say, the more superficial problems. But then there's also deeper inequities with this hybrid model, which I think we will discuss anyway in a bit. But they also revolve around, visibility, career progression, promotions, and so forth.
Definitely, we're gonna definitely dive into those areas. Just picking up on this kind of 3 days in and 2 days out, or 2 days in and 3 days out. I've always felt that it was just the easiest, in theory, the easiest option to go with, because you didn't have to worry about different leaders being perceived as being unfair or being too relaxed. You just had this kind of one-size-fits-all standard, everybody is in on these days. But it actually has always felt to me a really clumsy way of going about it, because what you've got is people saying, well, I'm doing emails today. Why do I have to be in? I can be so much more productive at home. People, perhaps who are younger, who perhaps don't have the space, they're living, sleeping, eating in one room, particularly in the bigger cities, does it make sense for them to be in that kind of environment? Whereas, you get to my age, chances are you've got more space and it's a bit more comfortable. Yeah. So it always felt to me that one size fits all to really lack the nuance that we need to reflect individual choice, business, the nature of the way in which business units are run, and also the way in which people want to work at any particular time. It always felt just a bit clumsy and a bit heavy-handed.
Absolutely.
So we're going to get into hybrid and how we can perhaps make it work better. But let's kind of celebrate the office, right? Because it gets a bit of a hard time. What do you see as the most overlooked advantage of being physically in the office?
I would say, I think one of the most powerful aspects of office life, which is sometimes really people underestimate, are these informal, spontaneous interactions. The unplanned chats in the hallways, the kind of quick sanity check over a coffee, the impromptu brainstorming, that starts by somebody going like, hey, I was thinking about this. Can we just chat for a minute? These moments, I think, are often dismissed because they're not not easily measured, and you don't usually find them on a dashboard, so that's why, but they form a very important foundation of how we work, and they are also how we as people, how we form trust, how we build relationships, how we figure out problems together, how new ideas are born. So in a remote setup, these moments have to be scheduled, and I think that is really crucial, because that is the foundation of how we work in so many ways.
I think that's really interesting, because I was reading somewhere that interactions within teams had actually gone up during the pandemic. Because, and I know because I experienced it with my own team, we're a fully remote organization at Disruptive HR. But actually the advent of Zoom and how easy and effective it was meant that we were finding it much easier to have meetings as a team. But for larger organizations, the research suggests that those extra outside your immediate team, that has dropped off significantly, as you say, those kind of, by the water cooler in the lift. And that serendipity, that just the kind of coincidence of bumping into somebody, and what does that lead to? And hopefully we can have a look at what we can do about that. Now, you've written about the kind of long-term risks of a weakened culture, even weakened commitment as a result of hybrid. What signals should leaders be watching for to make sure that their organization isn't heading in that direction?
Well, I think when the culture starts to erode, it does not happen overnight. So this is something, it's slow, it's quiet, sometimes it's hard to detect until it starts to show up, perhaps by in numbers. For example, increased attrition, increased disengagement, and these you can always spot through also surveys, right? But I think things like lack of clarity about purpose, direction, priorities. If you ask 5 people, what is the team focused on, and you get 5 different answers, then you know that we're not sailing in the same direction, right? Then this is already a problem. You also see lower effort or lower discretionary effort from people. The work becomes very transactional. People just do their tasks, but nothing else. So they no longer, they stop having ideas or talking about new things. They don't want to volunteer for things. It's all about just let me do my job and I'm out of here for the day, So it becomes extremely transactional. And we also saw that in individual contributor roles, people are so focused on their own KPIs that this whole notion of helping others, it's lost. So what people tend to do then is they just finish their work. And if they have time, maybe at the end, they might check in with somebody who would ask them for help. But otherwise, that's no longer important. So you also move from a culture that becomes very individualistic and not really shared or collaborative.
And is this research that you've done for the book that you can substantiate, or is this just kind of anecdotally what you're hearing from organizations?
Yeah. Well, in the book, we actually refer to a focus group that was conducted by Peter Capelli with a colleague of his, Jasmine Wu, which consisted of 720 people. And these were some of the major issues that they came up with. So it is based on fact, but it's also based on literature of what we've read.
So let's have a look at some of the problem practices around hybrid working that, we've all kind of experienced. So the hot desking piece, it used to be when the office was bigger pre-pandemic, we all had our own desk and it was great. And now suddenly space has been reduced and we're hot desking and we don't have that place to put our pictures up and our biscuits and our cuddly toys and things. If we have inconsistent anchor days and we're rocking up and other people aren't, or just that kind of poor meeting practices, where we've all been on the receiving end, where you're the only one on the Zoom call and other people are in a meeting room and they're kind of talking to each other and you can't quite feel, how do I get into this conversation? Or worse, the whole conversation is directed at you on the screen rather than having a more kind of fluent interaction. What are some of the kind of practical fixes that leaders can put in place right now to avoid some of the problems with hybrid working?
Yeah, I mean, Lucy, this is a very good point, because I also feel like things like the hot desking that you mentioned, the vague anchor days, the endless video calls and so forth, this is part of a bigger problem, which is hybrid without strategy, hybrid without being intentional about it. So that's one thing. But in terms of, there are some very simple practical fixes. The first one is, you have to design days with purpose, not with presence. So, don't just say everybody, as we were saying, everybody come into the office Tuesdays and Thursdays. Instead, you should think, what do we need to do in person that we cannot do online? Things like plan anchor days around activities that thrive on this level of proximity. Yeah. So onboarding, collaboration, feedback sessions, innovation sprints, these things. So to make it worthwhile for people to come in. Also fix the meeting culture. Really understand what requires a meeting and what does not require a meeting. Introduce like meeting-free blocks where you say, there's no meetings on Friday afternoons. Even, companies that are fully remote, like GitLab and Atlassian, they have huge documents about how to conduct meetings, who should be there, when to have this meeting, when is it just a simple phone call instead, who participates, the number of participants. So everything is really intentional and structured. So this would be a good way.
Just mentioned that about the phone call. I was having a conversation with one of my team, and we actually did it by a phone call, and it felt so uplifting. I don't know why. I think there's something about the ability to maybe walk around whilst you're doing it. There's a lack of intensity because you're not staring at someone. We're all sick of looking at ourselves, aren't we? And actually, it just felt freer.
Yeah. And I agree. And sometimes you don't even need, sometimes it could just be a simple email. You don't have to get 6 people to get on a call to have a conversation for 30 minutes when a simple email could have resolved that. But the problem is that those meetings, and back to what you mentioned, Lucy, there's a big difference between smaller organizations and bigger ones. And the bigger organizations, what we saw in the last years, the number of meetings have gone up. The number of participants have gone up because there's no,
because you can.
Because you can, exactly. And then because people are typically with their cameras off and multitasking, then there's a post-meeting meeting after the meeting to make sure that everybody who is not paying attention now knows what's happening. So there's a lot of wasted time, a lot of inefficiencies with that.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned about one of the problems of hybrid can be promotions going wrong, or at least not going wrong, but perhaps this proximity bias kicking in. And we know the research tells us, doesn't it, that if we've got people that we see every day, we're more likely to think that they're performing better, that they're therefore better candidates for promotions than those who are perhaps working remotely. How can you avoid this? Have you got any examples of organizations that have managed to make sure that they're rewarding the right people, promoting the right people, not just the loudest or the most visible?
Yeah, I mean, that is actually one of the biggest challenges, I think, in this hybrid setups, because as you mentioned, we often reward visibility rather than value. So, the suggestions that we've had is things like, measure outcomes, not just optics. So don't measure it's not about who's the loudest on your Zoom call or who's the most engaged in your Slack meetings, but it's really about impact. What impact is there? And that also has lots to do with the KPIs. Actively seek input also. beyond the usual voices. So a lot of organizations now, they talk to peers. I think it was Shopify that, if I remember, and I think Atlassian, that they do this 360-degree peer feedback, and to make sure that they really understand, who is doing what, so that it's not just about what the manager says, because maybe that manager is very much, influenced by that proximity bias. You also have to create kind of structured, transparent promotion criteria. It has to be very, written down, very clear who's doing what and why and by when, so that we don't also have these issues when it comes to, appraisal times.
And building on that, I think it was Ernst & Young who do this kind of checking in with each other's biases at the point where they're about to make a promotion decision, which I really like, because, if you have a view that someone is better because they are, you see them more regularly, it can be quite hard to overcome that. But actually having someone checking in with you and saying, so would you be necessarily feeling this way if you saw them every day? It's not going to resolve it, but at least it just helps you be more aware of that potential bias. Thanks, Ranya. I'm going to pause here for a moment and just mention our Disruptive HR Club. Now, we've got thousands of members in the club, and these are typically HR professionals who want to do things differently. And as club members, you get tons of resources, live and on-demand training to help you make the changes that you want to make. Now, if you're interested, just check out our website at disruptivehr.com. You can find links in the show notes from this podcast. Okay, let's go back to meeting with Ranya and talking about in praise of the office, the dilemmas of hybrid working. And in your book, you talk about that there are kind of two cultures now, post-pandemic, two cultures. Those who were hired before the pandemic and those who were hired after, which I'm fascinated by. I'd never thought about it that way. We tend to see kind of divides in hiring in terms of generations, don't we? But post and pre-pandemic, how's that divides playing out, and what can HR do to bridge it?
Yeah, so this was actually something that was very interesting for me as well. Before the pandemic, and I saw that in one of my previous organizations, if you know each other before, you have this shared kind of history, you have these lived experiences in the office, you have this informal networks that were already built, right, beforehand. The ones who came after or during the pandemic, for example, they were often onboarded remotely, and they have fewer touch points and a much looser connection to the culture. So this divide shows up in very subtle ways, but quite significant. So, for example, newer employees, they feel perhaps less comfortable in speaking up, in asking for help, or navigating kind of the politics of the organization. We also saw that they're often missing mentors, or, these informal guides that you get, relationships that usually spontaneously happened in the office. And because of that, they feel a bit disconnected with the culture, especially with the new generation, with the Gen Z. What we see now is that they are very much, the loyalty is very different. And that shows up as well. Now, what can...
It would be interesting if they're doing survey analysis, actually looking to see whether these differences are showing up in terms of length of tenure and when they joined, were they post-pandemic or not. It's certainly, I'm not aware of if anybody's doing that. If you are doing that, do let us know. It'd be fascinating to understand.
I'll let you know
what's showing up for you in terms of data. So what can HR do to kind of begin to bridge some of these gaps?
Well, I think the first thing HR can do is to really rethink onboarding more as a cultural integration rather than just a checklist. So it's not just about coming in and we have a 1 week onboarding. No, it's really about think 90 days, think even 6 months. Doesn't have to be like every week check-ins, but to really structure structure meetings regularly and have frequent interactions. And really create moments of connection as well. They can
I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think, so much of onboarding has been taken over by checklists and policy information. And yet ultimately what we want is for people to feel socially accepted, to feel welcome, to build those connections, to really start to network outside of the immediate team. And I think we're definitely seeing the more progressive organizations who are thinking about kind of that social aspect. And I don't mean parties, I mean the social connections.
And also simple things like, when newcomers join, pair them together, so that like all the new cohorts, pair them together, pair them with also people who've been in the organization since the pre-pandemic, so that they can also informally guide them as well, so that they can create the connections, create shared experiences together, offsites, virtual team meetings or rituals, collaborative projects, and so forth. And so I think all of these things HR can do.
I think you used the word intentional earlier, and I think that's absolutely right. Whereas we perhaps would have assumed that over time it would have happened naturally, we need to be more deliberate and intentional. We have to create those things or the opportunities for those connections to happen. Now, obviously, there's this kind of raging debate going on at the moment. You've got some CEOs that say remote work is a complete competitive disadvantage, everybody back in the office, whereas others are saying, but you're crazy, we're going to lose good people. Flexibility is essential to attracting talent. And where do you land on this tension?
First of all, I think Lucy, one important point to make is that organizations or companies that were remote, that were built remote, they operate in a completely different way. So this does not apply too much to them, what we're saying now, because they never had to unlearn anything, because this is how they were built. It was their operating model. Whereas for the hybrid ones, you were in office, then you went out of office, and then it was like, oh, it's going to fix itself. But as you mentioned, it doesn't fix itself. You have to help to fix it if you want it to work. So I think that we need to highlight, because that's an important part of that argument. But with regards to your question, I think remote work can be also a competitive disadvantage if it leads to cultural erosion, poor onboarding, disconnection. On the other side, as we've seen, the rigid office mandates are equally damaging because they drive away talent, as we've heard so often, and they feel more performative rather than purposeful. So I think the question that I would say is more, rather than where are people working, it's why, how, with what level of clarity and consistency are they working. So I think in this sense, leaders need to stop copying other companies, what they're doing, and really start designing ways of working that fits for them, their own values, their own work styles, their own talent needs. So as you mentioned previously, there is no one size fits all in my view. And that's where I land, which is I'm in favor of flexibility, but with structure. And I'm also in favor of presence, but with purpose. If you tell everybody, as we said, come to the office Tuesdays and Thursdays, but then you find yourself on a Zoom call, from the office with your neighbor who's on a Zoom call in the office, then I think that is completely not what we want to do. So I believe in the presence, but it has to be with purpose.
I'm just to build on that, because I absolutely share what you're saying. I think it is hybrid, but not hybrid as we've known it to date, which has been this kind of unintentional, just these are the days, show up and tick the box. But to think much more carefully about the physical environment in which they're going. I was talking to a head of property from Mondelez, and they've completely changed their office from 75% individual workspaces, 25% collaboration space, and they've completely switched that to 75 collaboration space, which of course is going to make sense and ties into your point that the office becomes somewhere that you really enjoy going, because you're doing different types of activities that you can't possibly get in a virtual world. I also think, though, that there's something about grown-up conversations rather than having a policy that is implemented across the piece, but actually to have conversations between a leader and their team members about what's right for us. So it's not just the organization, but it's what's right for our team. What work are we doing at the moment? Have we got new members joining? And just really thinking about what works for the individual, what works for the team, what works for their client, what works for the kind of activity that they're doing right now, and to have flexibility within that. So it's not that, we operate a standard 3 days, 2 days approach.
Absolutely.
Across the whole organization. And that, I think, I've seen HR struggling with, I've seen leaders struggling with, because they might not want or know how to have that conversation. I think it's Arkiva who helped leaders. They said, we're not going to give you a standard policy. We are going to give you conversation starters to have, a guide to have a meeting with your team about how you can arrive at what works for us in our team. And that, I think, went down extremely well. What role can you see HR playing as well in helping? You talked about, the rebuilding social ties, collaboration, innovation. What role do you see HR playing there?
Well, I read something the other day which I really liked, which was HR should be now the architect of connection. So, HR can help leaders in this sense, rebuild rituals, first of all, small, consistent moments, as we said, that bring people together across locations, team check-ins, learning circles, informal virtual coffees, things like that. And as you mentioned, also design for collaboration, not just coordination, right? So, you create the space for these cross-functional kind of problem solvings and for people to get together. Psychological safety, I think that is a big one, because, new joiners, remote workers, they might have quieter voices, some of them, and they need to feel really also empowered that they can contribute, and that they're not afraid to. And in hybrid settings, that's difficult sometimes. So you need to create, the space for that, so that where everybody can become visible.
Fantastic. So for leaders who want to keep flexibility but avoid the pitfalls of hybrid, what's one change? I hate doing this to people and I hate being asked, what's one thing, but I'm doing it anyway. What's one change you would advise them to make immediately?
I think the one thing, which is the simplest thing, is fix your meetings. Fix meetings. Honestly, because I've seen that, as we said, some of them are so poorly run. They take up so much of our daily, of our day. There's some of them are so inefficient. So I think here you need to streamline them. You need to be ruthless about them. Just simply say, if you're planning to get on this call, please have your camera on, so that everybody can actually attend focused and without the multitasking, And then once you've addressed this noise, I would suggest then you have to address the deeper issues, which is what we said, the more performance management, career development, that because these are vital. Because we want to avoid the out of sight, out of mind.
So I'm going to just ask you now to give one final case for why the office still matters. If you were addressing a skeptical workforce who are all wishing they could go back to the days where they could work from home and have more flexibility, and you're trying to sell them the idea of coming back in, what would you say?
Well, I would say, have you ever heard anybody say, I can't wait to go to the office because I want to finish my work? I haven't. What I've heard is, I can't wait to go to the office because I have a meeting with this person, or because I have a lunch scheduled with that person, or because I'm meeting him for coffee, or I have a strategy session with that person. So we come in because of the people. And I think that this sometimes we completely, we dismiss that, but this is very important because that is where everything happens, and it's all about the people. And if somebody was very skeptical, I would go on to say that it is that the business case of this, because there is a business case, it's not just I want to see my friends. The business case is simply that those relationships are the ones that help us to create trust in the workplace, that make you foster these kind of relationships that build loyalty. And when people, feel connected, we know they stay longer, they do more, and they really stretch further. So in that sense, I hope I'd be able to convince somebody with that.
Well, I started out skeptical because I work from home and I love it. But actually, I do hear what you're saying. So I would say where I land is probably similar to you. This is not about saying flexibility is bad. It's not about saying remote working is bad. But there are consequences that need to be carefully thought about. And that actually just going for a blanket 2 days out, 3 days in, or whatever you've got in your organization is probably not the right answer. There are different ways of handling it. And I was reading somewhere, it might be Linda Grattan, who's very good on this. And she was writing about the fact that, we went to our place of work for about 200 years. Now we're spending more time working in different environments, could be a coffee shop, could be from home. It's going to take us some time to get good at it. Yeah. So let's not dismiss it. Let's not go with these blanket policies, but, let's try and retain some of the benefits of the flexibility. But as you say, do it in a more intentional way. Yeah. So just a reminder, In Praise of the Office, the limits to hybrid and remote work is out on September 30th. So by the time this is going out, it should be in the shops and on Amazon. If people want to contact you, Ranya, what's the best way that they can do that?
Well, the best way is to connect with me on LinkedIn or just to drop me a line on info@ranyanehmeh.com.
Brilliant. And I'll make sure that the LinkedIn URL and your email are in the show notes. Ranya, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. It was really my pleasure as well.
Hi, and thanks for watching. If you found it useful, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications to get more videos like this.